When you think of ancient Greece, what comes to mind? Probably democracy, philosophy, right? All this incredible order. But here's the thing. Every single society has its fears, its enemies within. And for the Greeks, the biggest threats weren't invading armies. Nope. They were the disruptive forces that could tear their world apart from the inside out. So, let's dive into the pretty wild solutions they came up with to control the people they considered most dangerous.
So the big question is, how do they actually do it? I mean, this is a civilization totally obsessed with logic and civic duty. How did they handle people they saw as just agents of chaos? Well, the answer is fascinating. It reveals these two, I have to say, brilliant, if a little unsettling systems of social control. And each one was tailor-made for a very specific kind of threat.
Okay, but before we jump into the solutions, we really need to get inside their heads. We have to understand the problem from their perspective. We're going to look at the anatomy of what they were most afraid of, this powerful force they believed could literally dissolve the bonds holding their entire civilization together.
And that force had a name, misos. It's the Greek word for hate. And this is crucial, misos wasn't just, a personal feeling like being mad at someone. To them, it was this terrifying cosmic opposite of philia. Philia was everything. It was love, friendship, civic duty. It was the glue holding their world together. So in their minds, hate wasn't an emotion. It was a social disease, a real, tangible threat that could shatter the state. So where did they see this chaotic threat coming from? Well, the Greeks pinpointed two main sources. And the first one, it might surprise you. It wasn't a political rival, not a criminal, but something they saw as fundamental to nature itself. They believed it was women.
Wow, just listen to this quote from the poet Hesiod. It's pretty chilling, and it gets right to the heart of their worldview. He's talking about Pandora, the very first woman, and he describes her creation as a punishment for all of mankind. Think about that paradox for a second. An evil thing that you're glad of heart to embrace, even while it's destroying you. That's a heavy concept. And this idea has a name. They called it kalan kakon. It literally translates to the beautiful evil. And this, right here, is the absolute core of the Greek view on this. The idea was that women were, necessary, you need them to have kids and continue the family line, but that their fundamental nature was flawed. They saw them as inherently deceptive, chaotic, and dangerous, so much so that beauty itself was kind of a warning sign.
Okay, so if you believe this threat is literally woven into the fabric of creation itself, what do you do? How do you control it, right? You can't just pass a law against nature. So instead, the Greeks forged this incredibly powerful ideological weapon. And it wasn't a law, it was a story, a narrative, designed to justify total control. And you've definitely heard this story. It's Pandora. The key here is that her creation isn't some accident. It's a deliberate act of revenge by Zeus. He literally forges her to be a trap for men, beautiful on the outside, but filled with chaos and trickery on the inside. She is the original kalan kakon, by design.
And of course, her nature, that supposedly uncontrollable curiosity, leads to total disaster. She opens the jar, and bam! All the torment, pain, and disease in the world are unleashed. Just think about that. In one of their most important foundational myths, the origin of all human suffering is traced directly back to the actions of one woman.
And you have to understand, these weren't just bedtime stories. Myths about Pandora or Helen of Troy, whose beauty supposedly started the Trojan War, these were basically instructional manuals for their society. The lesson was hammered home over and over and over. Women are deceitful. Their independence leads to disaster. They are a scourge. Therefore, they have to be controlled. It's a pretty clear-cut, if brutal, logic.
So what was the real-world impact of this powerful mythological weapon? Well, it was pretty severe. For the elite women in Greek society, the solution was total containment. We're talking about being secluded in the home, completely cut off from public life. There was even a writer, Xenophon, who said they should be trained to see and hear and speak as little as possible. Essentially, the threat was neutralized by making them invisible and silent.
But, that whole system of control only dealt with half the population. The Greeks were just as terrified of another kind of enemy within, and this one couldn't exactly be locked away at home.
So what about dangerous men? What do you do when the threat isn't some beautiful evil, but a super charismatic, popular, and maybe dangerously ambitious guy? A man who could, become a tyrant,
and just tear down their precious democracy from the inside. For that, they needed a totally different weapon.
And what they came up with was, frankly, a remarkable political invention. It was this whole systematic process, and get this, it wasn't designed to punish a crime that had already happened. It was designed to prevent one from ever happening in the first place.
This system was called ostracism. And let's be super clear, this was not a trial. There was no specific crime, there was no accusation, you didn't get to mount a defense, it was a purely political act. The entire city would vote to kick someone out for 10 years simply because they were getting too powerful or too popular or just causing too many problems. It was like a preemptive strike to protect democracy itself. And the process itself is just a fascinating piece of democratic engineering. Here's how it worked. Once a year, the whole assembly would vote, hey, do we even need to hold an ostracism this year? If the answer was yes, they'd all gather again a couple of months later. And then every citizen could take a little shard of pottery, that's called an ostracon, and literally scratch the name of the person they wanted gone. As long as at least 6,000 votes were cast, whoever's name came up the most was exiled. 10 years. But, and this is key, he didn't lose his property or his status. He just had to leave town for a decade.
And this is where it gets really different from how we think about justice today, right? A modern trial is about punishing you for something you've already done. Ostracism was about exiling you for something you might do in the future. It had nothing to do with guilt or innocence. It was just a cold, hard political calculation by the citizens about who posed the biggest future risk to the whole system. A really good way to think about it is like political surgery. The point wasn't to punish the piece being removed. The point was to save the body. You take out this one potentially dangerous part to preserve the health and stability of the entire community before it can turn into something much worse.
All right, so we've looked at two very different kinds of threats and two completely different tailor-made solutions. Let's pull it all together and see what it tells us.
This really lays it out side by side. For the female threat, the perception was that it was this innate flaw, the beautiful evil. The weapon against it, pure ideology, myths and stories. And the method, permanent, lifelong seclusion in the home. Now look at the male threat. The perception was a potential tyrant, the weapon, a political procedure, and the method, a public but temporary 10-year exile. Totally different approaches. So what this all reveals is that these weren't just random disconnected acts. No, these were two highly specific, carefully engineered, and deeply gendered systems of containment. You have one system, built on stories and ideology, to control the private, domestic world forever, and you have a completely separate political system, designed for temporary control over the public political world. And all of this leaves us with a pretty big, lingering question, doesn't it? The Greeks used myths and broken pieces of pottery. It all sounds so ancient. But it really makes you think, what are the weapons that we use in our societies today to manage threats? Are they narratives, stories we tell that shape how we see certain groups of people? Or are they political and legal procedures that effectively remove people from the public square? It seems like every society, then and now, has to figure out how it's going to deal with its enemies within.